Welcome back to The Explainer. So, today we are unpacking a literally fascinating 28-month window in modern Indian history. We're zeroing in on the years 1937 to 1939. And you guys, this is a time when the Indian National Congress experienced what you could only call ultimate political whiplash. I mean, they transitioned practically overnight from fiercely protesting out in the streets to actually running the government in the state houses.
Okay, let's dive right into this core tension. Ask yourself, what actually happens when freedom fighters suddenly become the government? How does an anti-imperialist movement operate when they're tasked with running the exact same imperialist system they've been fighting against? You see, the Congress had just won these massive majorities in the provincial elections, and suddenly, they're holding the reins in provinces like Bombay, Madras, and the United Provinces. But, and this is a big but, they were still operating under the British Raj. This created just an incredibly complex dynamic.
To understand how they navigated this tightrope, here's our agenda. We're going to look at 1. From rebels to rulers, 2. Restoring civil liberties, 3. The complexities of agrarian reforms, 4. Labor and social welfare, and 5. Evaluating the 28-month rule.
Right, let's jump straight into part 1, from rebels to rulers, the initial hesitation. Now you have to remember, it wasn't an easy decision to just take power under a colonial constitution. Mahatma Gandhi's advice to these newly minted ministers was actually pretty stark. He told them to hold these offices lightly and not tightly, as a crown of thorns. He really wanted congressmen to view these positions not as prizes or trophies, but literally as a crown of thorns. He was advising them to use these offices in ways the British never intended, to prove they could govern with the absolute minimum assistance from the colonial police and army.
And that brings us to the basic limitations. The ministries could not change the imperialist character of the system or introduce a radical era. Because, look, despite all the massive public enthusiasm and this huge release of suppressed mass energy when the ministries were formed, they were operating in a rigid box. They had these built-in structural limitations. They simply couldn't change the overarching imperialist character of the whole system, and they definitely couldn't just unilaterally declare a radical new era of independence. They basically had to play the game with the cards they were dealt.
Which leads us to part 2, restoring civil liberties. Ideals versus pragmatism.
This era was such a fascinating clash of ideological purity versus, raw pragmatism. On one hand, you've got these incredible triumphs. They lifted press restrictions, released revolutionaries, revoked deportation orders, and even curbed CID surveillance. But historical nuance means we have to look impartially at the blemishes too. In a huge twist of irony, the freedom fighters kind of became the enforcers. They arrested socialists like Yusuf Meherali, used Section 144, and in Bombay, the Home Minister actually used that same colonial CID surveillance against communists and leftists.
Moving right along, let's hit part 3, complexities of agrarian reforms, uphill battles.
Before they could even attempt to fix the highly complex agrarian structure or pass massive debt relief laws, the ministries had to navigate the sheer weight of 7 basic constraints. They had inadequate powers, a serious lack of financial resources, they had to rely on a strategy of class adjustments with the zamindars, incredibly short timeframes, hovering war clouds by 1938, and reactionary second chambers in the provinces. Imagine trying to pass sweeping reforms when the government of India still controls all the real money. Plus, they were forced to appease powerful landlords just to get laws through those reactionary second chambers. Combine all that with the looming threat of World War II, and it was a remarkably steep uphill battle.
Despite those massive constraints, they did manage to legislate some laws relating to debt relief and land tenures. But as we can see, the benefits were highly uneven. The established statutory tenants and occupancy tenants saw real, tangible gains. They definitely benefited. But the subtenants? They didn't really benefit. And the landless agricultural laborers, largely because they just hadn't been politically mobilized into a voting bloc, saw practically zero benefit from these reforms.
Shifting our focus away from the fields, let's look at part 4, labor and social welfare, a flurry of activity.
Here we see another really delicate balancing act. The ministry's approach was to advance workers' interests, mediate disputes, advocate compulsory arbitration, and maintain industrial peace. But the reality on the ground got messy quickly. When militant trade union protests erupted, ministries often treated them as pure law and order problems. They arrested leaders and even passed the highly controversial Bombay Traders Disputes Act of 1938. Leftist critics were obviously deeply unsatisfied with this. Even Jawaharlal Nehru found himself in a real bind, privately unhappy about these repressive measures but publicly forced to support the ministries just to protect them from British criticism.
On the social front, however, it was a totally different story. The ministries unleashed this rapid-fire flurry of social welfare initiatives. They tackled public morality by imposing prohibition in certain areas and pushed hard for social justice with heritage and welfare programs like temple entry and scholarships. They poured attention into primary, technical, and higher education, subsidized Khadi and indigenous enterprises, and initiated major prison reforms. And looking entirely to the future, they even set up the National Planning Committee under Subhash Bose in 1938 to chart out an independent India's economic destiny.
Finally, let's zoom out to Part 5, evaluating the 28-month rule, the final verdicts.
We really have to remember the clock was ticking on this whole experiment. From the electrifying elections and formation of Congress ministries and provinces in 1937, through the extra-parliamentary mass activity and the formation of the National Planning Committee in 1938, right up to October 1939. That's when the outbreak of WW2 prompted the sudden resignation of the Congress ministries. It was a window of merely 28 months before it all came to an abrupt halt.
So, what was the actual legacy and impact of all this? Well, despite the internal contradictions in the super short time frame, the legacy is undeniably profound. It confirmed that Indian self-government was absolutely necessary for radical change. It showed that state power could be used without being entirely co-opted. They successfully controlled communal riots, neutralized hostile elements like landlords, and, perhaps most importantly, their sheer administrative competence severely lowered the morale of the colonial bureaucracy.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought. Did the 28-month rule prove that Indians were ready to govern themselves? The work done here didn't just shatter the imperialist myth that Indians were somehow unfit to rule. It gave the masses a tangible, messy, but very real taste of what independence could actually look like. It really forces us to ask how much of the bureaucratic DNA of modern India was forged right here, in this brief spark of time. Thanks so much for joining me to unpack this incredible chapter in history. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.